Hi everyone, welcome to Logo's LGBTQ State of the Union on Facebook Live. My name's Sarah McBride. I'm the National Press Secretary at the Human Rights Campaign, the nation's largest LGBTQ civil rights organization, and the author of the forthcoming book, Tomorrow Will Be Different: Love, Loss, and the Fight for Trans Equality. Tonight, President Donald Trump will be addressing a joint session of Congress, the Supreme Court, his cabinet, the nation, and the world. I'm here with an incredible and distinguished group of activists and experts to discuss the LGBTQ State of the Union, to reflect on the past year, and to look forward to the year ahead. Our community has seen victories and setbacks. We've seen tests of strength and celebrations of love. But one thing remains true. We must remain united to achieve equality and justice for all. Before we get started, I'd like to introduce our speakers and have them tell us a little bit about themselves. So, Peppermint?
I'm Peppermint from RuPaul's Drag Race and a trans activist. Good morning.
Hi, I'm Adam Eli. I'm a community organizer in New York City, and I am the founder of Voices For.
Hi, I'm Shelby Chestnut. I'm with the Transgender Law Center, and I'm based here in Brooklyn, New York.
Wonderful. We're going to have folks deliver a couple remarks on a number of different topics, but I want to invite viewers to leave questions in the comments. I'll remind you a couple times throughout the program. You can leave questions. We're going to answer them. We're going to discuss the topics you ask us about after we have our remarks. But let's get started. First, I want to have Peppermint, who was the RuPaul Drag Race's 9th season runner-up and a wonderful, wonderful trans activist. Peppermint will be speaking about issues facing the trans community. Peppermint?
I'm here representing the transgender community because this year our union came under attack. If you've seen the news, you already know that we're under attack from the outsiders. After Trump took office, he quickly tweeted his intention to bar transgender Americans from serving in the armed forces. His directive would have banned all trans recruits from enlisting, kicked out those currently serving, and banned any transition-related surgeries. For just a moment, forget just that a moment that a man who took 5 deferments from serving in the military during Vietnam is denying those in the transgender community their patriotic duty, the opportunity to serve their nation, to fight for freedoms that they are being actively denied. But consider that the total cost of transition-related surgeries in the military is about $8.4 million out of $50 billion in defense spending, or just 0.01%. compared to the cost of erectile dysfunction prescriptions in the military, which totals over $84 million, literally 10 times the price. All of a sudden, it's not too expensive. How about that? The attacks on our community didn't discriminate based on age either. Trump also rescinded protections for transgender students that had allowed them to use bathrooms corresponding with their gender identity. These are our nation's most vulnerable young people who are being targeted for no other reason than transphobia. Sadly, the attacks on the transgender community also came from within. Transgender women of color are in an intersection of society that very few people can identify with, a point where transphobia, racism, misogyny all play a part in the systemic oppression that has had tragic consequences on its people. And that's most apparent with the lopsided murder rate in the trans community. In 2017, there were 28 murders in the trans community that we know of. Not only disproportionately, but a high record. 2017 alone was the deadliest year on record for transgender Americans ever. Americans ever, especially for trans women of color, who suffered 3/4 of those attacks. If a transgender person is murdered, there's an 84% chance that they are a person of color and an 80% chance that she's a woman. Those odds really don't bode well for someone like me. Even more tragic, many of those murders often come at the hands of the men closest to us, our partners, our boyfriends, and our husbands and our lovers. These are the men that we trust not only with our hearts, but our safety. Whether it's stigma or panic or fear, they're historically the ones who have been responsible for the deaths of so many trans women. But amid the onslaught of attacks, 2017 was also a year that we learned how to defend ourselves, a year that we learned how to attack back. We attacked at the polls on November 7th, 2017. There were eight transgender candidates who won elections in the United States. Danica Roem became the first openly transgender candidate to win not only to win a state race, but that's not even the best part. She unseated a man named Bob Marshall, a Virginia Republican, best known for the Physical Privacy Act or the bathroom bill. The legislation was designed to target trans people by prohibiting them from entering any restroom that doesn't correspond with their sex at birth. The uniquely dangerous bill also required school principals to notify a student's parents within 24 hours if a child asks to be referred to as a member of the opposite sex, or to use a different bathroom. Now, armed with that knowledge, let the significance of this sink in. A transgender woman replaced the author of a bill designed to hurt her. We were also attacked in the courts. In Wisconsin, a U.S. Court of Appeals ruled that Ash Whitaker, a 17-year-old transgender student, must be allowed to use the boys' bathroom at his high school, a decision that will have far-reaching implications for similar cases. In federal court, two separate judges have struck down Trump's transgender military ban. The most recent judge said it cannot possibly constitute a legitimate governmental interest. I'm sure that's as close to throwing shade as a federal judge can possibly get. And listen, we're not talking any landslide victories here, but progress rarely is. Finally, a transgender person was responsible for permanently deleting Trump's Twitter account. Okay, fine, that hasn't happened yet, but I'm putting good vibes out there. Yes, the trans community came under attack this year, but the fight is far from over. The silver lining of being the target of such vile hatred in 2017 is that Americans, a people who overwhelmingly value progress, tolerance, and love, have seen our struggle and have heard our stories. Granted, this fight won't end anytime soon, but slowly, eventually, promisingly, the tide will turn. If 2017 taught us anything, it's that the fight is winnable. So speak out, push back, and be heard. We're definitely going to flip the script in 2018.
Well, that was a wonderful, wonderful set of remarks, Peppermint. And you know, I think one of the things that people, I'm sure, took away from that, and one of the things that we've obviously been seeing and talking a lot about over the last year, 2 years, 3 years, is this topic of bathrooms for the trans community. And I think a lot of people are curious and confused as to why we are talking so much about bathrooms, why our opponents are talking so much about bathrooms. I think obviously one reason is that bathrooms are a place where everyone sort of feels vulnerable and a little out of their element. But the reason is a little bit more insidious than that. It's actually a lot more insidious than that. It's the fact that if transgender people like us can't use restrooms that make sense for us, if we can't use restrooms consistent with our gender identity, then it becomes much more difficult for us to go to work. It becomes much more difficult for us to go to school or to really even leave our house for more than 2 hours. And these bathroom bills, these attacks on trans students' rights in schools, these are nothing more than thinly veiled attempts to legislate and push transgender people out of public life.
Yeah, to erase us.
To erase us from public life. And that is the tragic theme across the board in all of these attacks. I think so often we reduce these to public policy debates, but in reality, these are attacks to erase us. And I think that came through in your remarks. So I thank you for sharing that. Do either of you have any thoughts on what we just heard?
Well, I also think, I think it's important that you highlighted what you did, Peppermint, and, you're raising the question around bathrooms. It's also, we're seeing that trans people are winning in these debates and organizing. Earlier this year in 2017 in Texas, during the special legislative session, trans people mobilized and defeated an anti-trans ballot measure that would bar them from using the bathroom that they needed to use. And it's just the power of trans people to really mobilize that quickly and defeat these things. It's like people are ready and they're mobilizing and they're doing the work that they need to do to live in their communities.
So, we've talked a little bit about the challenges the trans community is facing and has faced in the United States, but it's important to remember that the LGBTQ community isn't just a local or national community. We're also a global community. And I have with me Adam Eli, who's the founder of Voices For, to talk a little bit about this global moment in LGBTQ equality. Adam?
Sure. Thank you so much, Sarah. I'm really excited to be here. My name is Adam Eli, and my name is Adam Eli. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm a community organizer in New York City. I advocate for queer people abroad, queer immigrants, and refugees and asylum seekers that are already living in America. Last year, I watched from the safety of my cell phone as reports of LGBTQ persecution spread from Chechnya to all over the world. Because of similar government-sponsored violence against the Jewish people, my great-grandparents fled Russia and resettled in America in 1906. As a queer third-generation Russian immigrant, I knew it was time to act. This was the moment that they had trained me for in Hebrew school, and never again was now. In reflecting on the past year, our global community won some big victories, such as marriage equality in Germany and Australia. However, the global LGBT community is in crisis, including here in America. As Peppermint so eloquently just stated, the trans community continues to face high rates of violence, murder, and is under constant attack from the Trump administration. Trump's bigotry poses a threat to people not only in America, but to queers everywhere. Trump's travel ban impacts our community and can easily double as a list of the world's worst places to be queer. Right now, in this very moment, Trump is gambling with the fate of 36,000 queer DACA recipients. They are facing possible deportations to countries where they will meet higher rates of violence for being who they are. In the past year alone, hundreds of queer people have been kidnapped, tortured, extorted, and murdered in Russia and other post-Soviet countries. In Brazil, conversion therapy is now legal again. Egyptian lawmakers are currently considering what is being called the worst anti-LGBT law in the world. Simply holding a rainbow flag in public could land you 1 to 3 years in prison. We live in a world that is plagued with transphobia and misogyny, and unfortunately, our community is no different. It is unsurprising but devastating that gay men are being placed at the center of today's international crisis. Let me take this moment to be clear about something. Along with gay men, each of these countries is persecuting lesbians, bisexual people, trans people, and anyone who defies the gender binary in any way. Just yesterday, 12 transgender women were arrested and imprisoned in Indonesia. Reports say their heads were shaved, they were imprisoned, and forced to wear men's clothing as a part of a training on how to be men. What's happening in Indonesia and Chechnya and around the world is not a gay purge. It is an attempt to eradicate any trace of queer existence. No matter how the mainstream media chooses to frame it, we must understand that this issue impacts the entire queer community. The good news is that there are tangible things we can do to help. The first thing we can do to help is protest. My experience within this movement has taught me that protest really works. When a group of people protest outside of a consulate in New York, that government gets a report and will often stave off the abuse for at least a few days. These few days can save lives. We also must protest at the intersection of our movement. For example, queer Muslims are suffering greatly under this wave of violence. Anyone fighting for LGBTQ rights should be at a no travel ban protest too. Finally, we can support local organizations. Being an immigrant, refugee, or asylum seeker in America is not easy. Being queer makes it even more difficult. All over the country, there are organizations that provide basic needs for immigrants, and if you can't donate money, spending time connecting with your queer family goes a long way in making people feel welcome and heard. This summer, I started a grassroots, nonviolent direct action activist group called Voices For. We operate on a single founding principle. You mess with one queer, you mess with us all. In the Talmud, an ancient Jewish scripture, there's a rule, Kol Yisrael Avrim Ze Bazeh. All of Israel is responsible for one another. It basically means that Jewish people have the obligation to care about other Jews simply because they are Jewish. This is my vision for the queer global community, for us all to internalize the idea that queer people anywhere are responsible to help queer people everywhere. If the global queer community begins to think of itself as a single entity, a family with no borders, its power would be immeasurable. I'm here to say that helping queer people around the world and at home is possible, but more importantly, it is our responsibility to do so.
Thank you so much for that, Adam. I think some really powerful points in there, and I think one of the things that really comes to mind, the word that comes to mind for me is solidarity in your talk, and the fact that when you talked about these attacks that we have seen against LGBTQ people across the world and how we sort of characterize these attacks as a gay purge or attacks on the gay community, in many cases, that's also the language that those leaders who are implementing these discriminatory policies, they sort of view LGBTQ people as gay people writ large. And it's a really powerful point that underscores why we are one community, which is that homophobia and transphobia are inextricably linked. And I think Laverne Cox says it best, that when she was on a playground as a young person, it wasn't necessarily the T word she was called, it was the F word that she was called. And we know that transphobia and homophobia, along with misogyny and sexism, are rooted in this notion that one perception at birth, the sex we are assigned, should dictate who we are, how we act, and who we love. And so I think your point and your remarks really encapsulate that. Do either of you have any other thoughts on what we just heard?
Yeah, I think obviously we know that being a good neighbor and a good global citizen is really important, but just your remarks really drive home the point that how many intersections there are between religion and sexuality and gender and even nationality, and how important it is to be at a no travel ban protest, or to be at maybe a vigil for a murdered trans person, even if you happen to be a gay man living on the Upper East Side who doesn't think that they know any trans people. So I think it's really important that we strengthen our community that way and remind ourselves, and I think you did a great job of that.
Thank you.
And now I have the pleasure of introducing a fierce activist who is sitting across from me, Shelby Chestnut, who is the National Organizing and Policy Strategist for the Transgender Law Center. Shelby, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Hi viewers, my name's Shelby, and as they said, I'm the National Organizing and Policy Strategist at the Transgender Law Center. And TLC is the country's largest trans-led organization working to keep transgender and gender nonconforming people alive, thriving, and fighting for liberation. We do this through organizing, policy, litigation, and leadership development. And early on in this administration taking office, TLC was clear that trans communities would face intense attack, and that business as usual wasn't going to cut it. The only way for us to make it through was to remember how trans people have always survived and resisted in moments of crisis, through community. We created a plan of resistance that relied heavily on mobilizing our community. We launched a new volunteer program to meet the increased requests for legal support. We expanded our movement building work with leadership trainings across the country. We doubled down on our community-led programs doing work on the ground like Positively Trans, which is led by an advisory board of over a dozen trans people living with HIV, and Truth, which is led by trans and gender nonconforming youth who are using media and organizing and resisting. We also scaled up our immigration work by launching the Trans Immigrant Defense Effort. Major areas of focus have been responding to anti-trans attacks on the state and federal level, including work around the Masterpiece Cake case currently before the Supreme Court, supporting the first ever trans caravan of transgender people from Central America who crossed the border seeking asylum in the US, defeating anti-trans legislation in Texas, and working with states like Montana and Alaska who are currently facing anti-trans ballot measures to prepare to mobilize their leaders. We have also seen a great deal of targeting against low-income trans communities and trans communities living with HIV, and how harmful rollbacks within the CDC, HHS, and healthcare broadly will have on our communities. In 2017, we saw devastating death and violence targeting trans people, matched with a great deal of resistance and trans leaders leading the conversation and work around ensuring the women's movement is inclusive of trans women and non-binary people, and how if we are to center trans people, we must center trans women of color, immigrants, Black communities, Indigenous communities, and communities of color who are leading this work all around the country. While we continue to monitor and respond to anti-trans attacks daily from the federal government, we also see major wins when trans people are telling their stories, driving policy decisions, and at the front lines of issues impacting their lives in small and big ways. In 2018, I call on people to support the leadership of trans people. And if you aren't trans, you should push to make sure that your schools, your community, and your organization center trans voices and experiences in authentic ways, particularly trans people of color. Educate yourself by checking out initiatives like the Black LGBT Migrant Project housed at the Transgender Law Center, and learn more about the issues facing trans people beyond the surface level headlines and how folks are organizing to resist. It is extremely important that people engage in conversations around defeating anti-trans legislation, anti-immigrant legislation, HIV criminalization, and moving beyond the debate, beyond the bathroom debate being the only thing that trans people are facing discrimination. As we head into 2018 midterm elections, we must continue to educate voters on trans issues and put forward progressive candidates who will promote the rights of trans and gender nonconforming people around the country. I call on everyone to join TLC's community resistance effort, and you could check us out at transgenderlawcenter.org/volunteer. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shelby. And I just want to remind people that if you're watching and if you have questions or topics that you'd like us to talk about after our remarks, please feel free to put them in the comments, and we'll get to as many as we can. Shelby, I think I want to add snaps to what you were talking about of the fact that I think over the last year we have seen so many more trans people come to the forefront of this movement, and so many, and really the power of trans voices, that when we speak out, and I'm going to talk a little bit about this, but when we speak out, when we tell our stories, when we're leading the movement and talking about what we really need, people respond to that. People respond to that sort of authentic advocacy. It allows them to see trans people in our beauty and our diversity, and sort of move past the caricatures that we see by the opponents of equality. And I just, snaps to what you just said. I think it's so important, and definitely the lesson from the last year, and sort of a call to action for us moving forward. Either of you have any thoughts?
I thought that was really beautiful, and I am a big fan of TLC, and I loved how your remarks were so intersectional, talking about how transphobia and anti-HIV criminalization and immigrant work are all tied together, and we should definitely connect after this and see if there's something we can work on together.
I love that we can connect people here and make work happen.
Sorry, guys.
No, of course, it's wonderful. Well, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the need for us, to your point, and to what we were just talking about, of being intersectional and of the fight ahead. As I mentioned, my name's Sarah McBride. I'm the National Press Secretary at the Human Rights Campaign, the nation's largest LGBTQ civil rights organization, and I'm also the author of the forthcoming book, Tomorrow Will Be Different: Love, Loss, and the Fight for Trans Equality, which comes out this March. Over the last year, we have witnessed relentless attacks from the Trump-Pence administration against the LGBTQ community. From the rescinding of life-saving guidance promoting the protection of transgender students, to the granting of a sweeping license to discriminate against LGBTQ people and other Americans for government workers and federal contractors, to the attempts by the president and vice president, as Peppermint talked about, to reinstate a ban on transgender people serving openly in the military. But we also know that the challenges facing our community did not begin on January 20th, 2017. Before that date, and to this day, a majority of states and the federal government still lack clear and explicit protections from discrimination for LGBTQ people. And through it all, the LGBTQ community is as diverse as the fabric of this nation. We are workers and women. We are Black, Latinx, Asian, and Indigenous. We are Muslims and immigrants, and we are people with disabilities. Audre Lorde reminds us that there is no such thing as a single-issue cause because no one lives single-issue lives. And that's why, as others have said, we must fight back to protect dreamers, including LGBTQ dreamers, from deportation. It's why we've resisted as a community in lockstep with so many others, all attempts by this administration to rip health care away from millions of Americans, including those living with HIV and transgender people. It's why, as a movement launched in response to police violence at the Stonewall Inn, we must always declare that Black Lives Matter. For those in our community living at the intersection of multiple marginalized identities, we must never forget that the toxic mix of transphobia, homophobia, misogyny, racism, and other prejudices can have often fatal consequences. As Peppermint mentioned, 2017 was the deadliest year on record for the transgender community. 28 transgender people, most of whom were transgender women of color, were murdered. Each and every one of them were lives filled with hopes and dreams. Peppermint mentioned that oftentimes that violence came at the hands of a loved one. Other times it has come at the hands of a stranger. Hate-based violence is a national emergency. And while bigotry, discrimination, and hate violence is sadly not new, there is no doubt that it has been inflamed and emboldened by politicians all too eager to appeal to the darkest undercurrents of American society. This is a moment of choosing for our country and for all of us as a community. And we have been called to a righteous cause. It's not just our nation's children who are watching. It's also posterity. The countless generations for whom this moment, this time right now, is a chapter in their history books of tomorrow. And while every chapter may be influenced by politicians and presidents, we know that in the end, they are written by each and every one of us, by the decisions each one of us make every single day to either be silent in the face of prejudice or persecution, or to speak out, to fight back, and to bend that arc of the moral universe just a little bit more towards justice. As we saw in North Carolina in 2016, as we saw this year in Alabama with the election of Doug Jones, and as we saw, as others have talked about, in the Commonwealth of Virginia when Danica Roem ousted the state legislature's self-designated chief homophobe, when diverse voices are heard, when all of us in the LGBTQ community speak out, when we mobilize and organize as a community, we can still defeat the politics of fear and division, of discrimination and misinformation. With anti-equality politicians in leadership positions in the White House, in Congress, and in far too many states, we certainly have our work cut out for us. But this year, as voters head to the polls in crucial states across the country, we have the opportunity not just to defeat the politics of hate, but to elect candidates who will work with us to move equality forward at the local, state, and federal level. And that's why this past summer, the Human Rights Campaign launched HRC Rising, our largest expansion and investment in grassroots organizing in our organization's nearly 40-year history. We've hired more staff, we're working to enhance infrastructure in critical states across the country, and we're expanding our grassroots army of more than 3 million members and supporters so that this year, we can elect more pro-equality candidates up and down the ballot. In states like Wisconsin and Ohio, we can fight to re-elect senators like Tammy Baldwin and Sherrod Brown. In Arizona, we have a chance to elect a second openly LGBTQ person to the US Senate in Kyrsten Sinema. There are races just like this around the nation for the US Senate and House, but also for city councils and state legislatures, for mayors and governors. You can work with us to help achieve that change by visiting hrc.org or texting EQUAL to 30644, 30644. Over the last year, we have proven that no election, no presidency can silence our voices. From coast to coast and on countless main streets in between, we have resisted with pride in ourselves and with power in our voices. And that is the story of the last year. It's a story of our movement from Stonewall to the steps of the Supreme Court and beyond, that no matter the challenges we face, no matter how troubling the times, even in the darkest moments, we have transformed impossibility into possibility into reality. We have seen that change is possible, that nothing will stop the momentum of our movement, and we have proven time and time again that our voices matter. So thank you all. And now we have the pleasure of answering some questions from you all that you've left in our comments section. So the first question I want to pose to my awesome co-panelists is, what advice would you give to LGBTQ people? And this question is from Tracy. What advice would you give to LGBTQ people and allies who want to discuss the issues that we've talked about to a family member or a friend who voted for the president and anti-LGBTQ politicians? What advice might you give to them? That's a really big question.
Okay, Tracy, I think you have to, that could be a tough one, because around politics, especially if it's a recent election, it could get pretty personal. We know that politics is always something that's tough at the dinner table, but if it's a family member, I think bringing your own personal experience, if your personal experience is that of a queer person or a gender nonconforming person, bringing your own personal experience and feelings into the conversation, and maybe even reminding your loved one of how much you love them and how much you know they love you through this time, maybe that'll make it a little bit easier. I don't think that there's any way to predict how someone will react when you bring up these conversations. And that's often what stops people from coming out and revealing more about their personal lives to even the closest family members. But I do think it's important. And it's probably one of the essential points that we didn't really touch on today is having these conversations with our close family members, because these are the people who are also going out to the polls and voting, and also having these kind of water cooler conversations at work about people like us. Even if it's not about us, it's about people like us. And they are having these conversations. So I think that's a brilliant question. And you're very brave for even daring to bring up this conversation with a family member. And I hope you can do it with some ease and knowing that you're not alone, because right now we're all having these conversations with our family members.
I totally agree with you. I think that so often we try to articulate the most cogent case, but I think oftentimes our job as people advocating for ourselves or in allyship and accomplishment with others is not necessarily the most cogent case, but the most compelling case. Mm-hmm. And that comes from our lived experiences. I think so often, one of the things I learned during my advocacy work, and I learned this when I was working on a gender identity bill, I sort of went in to the state legislature in my home state of Delaware, and I would talk with legislators, and I'd talk about all the stats and all the facts, and I'd sort of provide this sort of removed, distant argument. And I think in some ways I was trying to shield myself from the potential feeling of personal rejection if they didn't vote for our bill. But the reality is that the political is personal for us. We can't separate these things. And I sort of figured out that vulnerability is oftentimes one of the most powerful things we can channel and present. And talking not just about the stats and the facts, but talking about the fact that when someone votes in a way that very clearly goes against your interests as a human being, your safety and your dignity as a person, talking about how that personally hurts us. Talk about how that makes you feel. Talk about how one of the most important things that any family member has is to demonstrate that they see us in our entirety, they see us in our dignity, they see us in our worth. And voting is a moral choice. It is probably about the most significant single decision each of us can make as people living in this country. And when someone votes against my safety and my dignity, they're saying they don't see me. They're saying that they don't consider my worth as much as they consider other people's worth. And I think communicating just how deeply we feel that is so important in these conversations. Do either of you have any other thoughts?
I mean, I'm definitely trying to avoid the dinner table screaming match, because I think that those can happen quickly. But, you know, I mean, being mindful of your safety, really pushing that personal narrative about how, like, if you hadn't supported me as a young person who was LGBT, like, I could very much be in a situation where I'm homeless and on the streets, and, like, right now my rights are being threatened as an individual, and I need your support. And really, you know, pulling on those heartstrings and reminding folks that whether they are LGBT or not, that they can stand up for LGBT rights. I think oftentimes it's really confusing for people too. They don't know what they're voting against or for. So I try and explain things in like layman's terms to my family, who's like super supportive and did not vote for Trump. But you know, at the same time, they may not understand this political rhetoric that I'm like shouting all the time.
Right.
So humanizing it.
Yeah. I echo everything that everyone said. My advice would be to proceed with kindness and empathy, and to remember that if it's too painful or if it hurts too much or it's too overwhelming, it's okay. You don't always have to. There will be other moments, and that living, like the power of a living example can go a really, really long way. So being an openly queer person and living with dignity and purpose and kindness, the people around you will see that and hopefully one day vote to respect that.
And I think just to add on to your points, because something that, you know, if someone's watching who's maybe not LGBTQ, but a friend or an ally or an accomplice in our fight, I think one of the most important things is for us to articulate that responsibility as allies to speak out and sort of take some of the burden away from those of us in this community. But I would also say that, you know, for those of us who are LGBTQ, for instance, who may be white, and citizens and able-bodied, you know, while we may not want to have to share the entire burden of talking about our own lived experiences as LGBTQ people, that doesn't absolve us of our responsibility to speak out as allies to people of color or to people with disabilities or to immigrants and undocumented folks. And so as we talk about this, it's important to remember that all of us are allies to other folks or have the potential to be. And we have that responsibility when we're talking about our own lived experience as LGBTQ people to lift up those whose identities you might not share, but who are just as much attacked by this administration. Kat asks probably the $30,000 question, what do you see as the biggest political challenges for the LGBTQIA plus community in 2018? What are some of the biggest challenges?
I'll go. I mean, I think we're seeing continued sort of pushback on a federal level, and it's continuing to ramp up. I mean, just a couple of weeks ago with HHS around this sort of religious freedom office. And how do we sort of fight that narrative? But then also, how do we advance policies and legislation that are pro-trans? And thinking creatively that, like, you know, while we might be stuck in this bathroom debate to some extent, which is huge, and it's a civil rights fight of our time, there's also ways that we can put pro-trans legislation within legislation throughout the country in creative ways and in subtle ways to sort of protect trans people. I mean, I think a thing that is becoming increasingly hard is the religious freedom conversation. And it's like, how can you be pro-religion and pro-trans? And it's possible, but it's like there's a number of people who are really bent on dividing this community. And how do we leverage faith-based leaders in this moment to put forward a conversation around protecting and lifting up trans people and LGBT people broadly, while also, you know, being mindful that people's basic civil rights are on the line here, and people's rights are being violated, and we as a country cannot stand for it. So if you're not trans, it actually is your duty to think about educating yourself on these issues, having some talking points, and to your point, bringing it back to like family. It's like conversations go a long way. Like, talk to your cousin, talk to your neighbor, talk to that person about, you know, like, hey, I have some friends who are trans and they're impacted by this issue, and I want to tell you a little bit more about it because it's not fair and it's a violation of civil rights.
Yeah, I think, you know, I think one of the challenges, I completely agree with everything Shelby just said, and I think one of the challenges we're going to face is we're pretty exhausted, and we faced a lot of attacks. It's, for many of us, it's been years or decades having to navigate a world that in many ways is built against us. And so I think it's going to be giving each other the support and help that we need to continue to resist and continue to fight to make sure we vote in 2018 and beyond, because we do still have the power in our voices and in our votes and in so much more to change the way this country is going. But we need to take care of ourselves, and I think that's going to be a challenge. Another question that we have is from Denise, a really a moving question. Denise asks or says, I'm a mom of a trans child. I am having a hard time with letting her go out of the house without me with her. I'm terrified of something bad happening to her that I never let her out of my sight. That's what Denise says. She's going to be 18 in a few months, and I know that I'll have to soon cut the cord. Do you have any encouraging words? Thank you so much. Wow. So it's a.
I think that's probably a question that most parents can identify with. I mean, I'm not a mom, but I would imagine that, like any parent getting ready to send their child out into the world at the age of 18 must be scary. But what I think is really comforting for me is that if this parent, is it Denise?
Denise.
If you've already been supporting your child who is identifying as trans and you've been with her at every step and have been so loving and so caring and supporting, then I believe that you've probably already been doing the right thing and you've already probably equipped her with the tools that she needs, including hopefully some confidence to face a lot of the challenges that we've been talking about here today. So I think you've done a great job, and at this point it sounds like you're just going through what every other parent might be going through. And, you know, I think you have nothing to worry about.
Well, yeah, and I want to say to Denise and to every parent of an LGBTQ person, particularly trans young person, that I just want to say thank you for loving your child. I know whenever I say that to parents, they say, "Well, that's my job," and it is, and it shouldn't be something that we have to make note of, but sadly in this world it is, and so I want to say thank you. And I think Peppermint is right that you have already equipped your child with probably one of the single most important factors in being able to survive and thrive, which is that no matter what they're facing, they know that they have a safe place that they can go home to, that they know their family will welcome them, that they know their family will support them, no matter the challenges that come their way. And that is huge. I mean, I can't imagine, I consider myself so lucky for so many reasons, so many different privileges, but one of the biggest is the fact that I have my family supporting me. And so I think your love and support for your child is a significant place where you can find support, courage and comfort in the fact that they're gonna go out into the world. Any other? So the last question we have is from Sean. Sean asks, what advice would you give to those of us who wish to help our LGBTQ friends from other countries to seek asylum here?
To seek asylum here?
Yeah.
Okay, so I would say that, Sean, that first of all, asking that question is a great way to start. It's super important that we acknowledge that people are suffering in other countries and that they need to get here. I would recommend finding an immigration. Okay, so at Voices, the group that I helped start, we have a rule in which we always work with someone who has either been through the violence directly or is an expert in that particular region. So I would start, like, we're not interested in being like American saviors, because I think our country has seen the disastrous effect of that. So I would say to go to a local immigration center or a local queer immigration center and go to a couple of meetings, maybe get comfortable, and ask people what they need. Like, literally walk up to them and say, like, I know there are people suffering in this country. How can I best be of service? Here are the list of skills I have. Like, when we walked in, we said we can raise money, and we're really good at social media, and we're really good at planning rallies. How can we be of service to you? And they really surprised me by saying, we need numbers and bodies at Brighton Beach Pride. And I didn't know that when a lot of queer people come here from post-Soviet countries, they go to Brighton Beach, where they face a huge amount of homophobia from the Russian community here. So people were facing homophobia and transphobia in Queens, and I didn't even know about it. So that would never have occurred to me. So Sean, I think that's a great question, and the only thing is you're asking the question to the wrong person. It's not me. You should be asking someone from your local immigration center.
Can I just add, there's a number of immigration resources available to people throughout the country that are free services, and the reality of it is, thinking of trans people specifically entering the US who may be seeking a variety of immigration options, their priority should be to speak to an attorney who's trans competent and knows what they're talking about and can sort of walk you through your options. Unfortunately, there's not a great deal of resources for trans people seeking any sort of immigration relief in this country. But you're lucky, because if you go to transgenderlawcenter.org, we have a whole trans immigrant defense initiative that we've launched really in response to the Trump administration, because so many people were in need of immigration resources in this moment, including those coming into the country seeking asylum. So check out our website, and it'll link you to resources that aren't trans specific if it's just broader LGB folks that are needing services.
Fantastic. So thank you all so much for joining in this conversation. For anyone who is watching online and wants to learn more about your organizations or you and how to get involved, what are some ways that they can do that? I know, Shelby, we already talked about this, but Shelby, why don't we start with you in case folks missed how they can get involved?
There's go on our website, you'll see a number of resources, but also ways that you can plug in. Because we're a national organization and we have partnerships with places like Southerners on New Ground through our TLC at Song, there's a number of ways that throughout the country you can just plug into our really groundbreaking trans-led work, whether it's in small ways or big ways, helping someone with their immigration stuff to just taking phone calls, No way is too small. So please check us out, transgenderlawcenter.org.
Got it. If you want to join or be a part of Voices for and tackle queer global liberation with us, the best thing to do is we're a full-time millennial movement. So I would say to follow us on Instagram. It's at voices4_, and everything will be updated. Everything will be updated there.
You can, it sounds kind of trite in comparison, but Follow me on social media.
I'm
not connected with
it's
an
worth
organ.
it. It's worth it.
I'm not really connected directly with any organizations, but I partner with great organizations like these all the time. So, and I tweet and talk about my experiences and kind of organize people on social media to go to rallies and do calls to action all the time. So just follow me, Peppermint247 on all platforms.
Fantastic. And as I mentioned, to get involved with the Human Rights Campaign, you can visit hrc.org, or literally right now, if you have your phone in your hand, you can text equal to 30644, 30644. I want to thank all of my co-panelists for joining with us, Peppermint, Adam, and Shelby. Thank you so much. We hope this discussion inspires you in the audience to get involved, to continue the fight, and to join us in the year ahead. In the spirit of Marcia, Sylvia, Harvey, and the countless heroes who fought and continue to fight for equality and justice, know that we will succeed. Thank you all, and have a great day.